My name is Jules Blackthorn, and I have killed 17 men in service to the crown. Each death weighs nothing against the life of the one I was sworn to protect, Queen Monique of Valdres, though I did not know then that she would become everything to me. The summons came on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn. I stood in the throne room, water still dripping from my leather armor, mud caked on my boots from 3 days of hard riding. The previous queen had died of fever, they said, though whispers in the corridors spoke of poison. Now her daughter, barely 22, sat upon a throne that felt too large for her delicate frame. She was nothing like what I expected. Queen Monique possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly in the flickering candlelight. Her hair cascaded in waves of deep auburn, catching the golden glow of the torches like liquid fire. But it was her eyes that captured me, deep green like the forest after rain, holding depths I couldn't yet fathom. There was strength there, hidden beneath the careful composure expected of royalty. Lord Irwin, the Queen's advisor, spoke the words that would change my life forever. I was to be her personal guard, her shadow, her sword. Where she went, I would follow. Her life would matter more than my own. These were not new concepts to me. I had served as royal guard for 3 years. But something in the way Queen Monique looked at me when Irwin spoke those words made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar sensation. That first night, I stood vigil outside her chambers, listening to the soft sounds of her moving about within. I tried to picture her removing the heavy crown, letting down that magnificent hair, becoming not a queen but simply Monique. The thought sent warmth through my body that had nothing to do with the brazier burning nearby. I pressed my back against the stone wall and forced myself to think of duty, of honor, of everything except the way her lips had curved in the slightest smile when our eyes met across the throne room. The days that followed blurred together in a routine that became as natural as breathing. I learned that Queen Monique rose before dawn, preferring to watch the sunrise from her balcony with a cup of herbal tea that smelled of lavender and honey. I learned that she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, melodies that seemed to float through the corridors like whispered secrets. She was not the fragile flower the court believed her to be. In private meetings with her council, her voice carried authority that commanded respect. She studied maps late into the night, planning trade routes and defensive strategies with a mind sharp as any blade I'd ever wielded. When Lord Joseph attempted to dismiss her concerns about the northern border conflicts, she fixed him with a stare that could have frozen flames. I admired her strength, but it was her gentleness that undid me. The first time I saw her tend to a servant's injured child, kneeling in her silk gown to bandage a scraped knee, speaking in soft tones that chased away tears, that was when I knew I was lost. She caught me watching and smiled, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, something I had kept carefully guarded for all my 26 years. The attraction was immediate and terrifying. Every day spent in her presence was exquisite torture. I memorized the way she moved through her chambers, graceful as a dancer. I catalogued the different shades of green in her eyes, the way they darkened when she was deep in thought or lightened when she laughed. I learned to read her moods in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the rhythm of her breathing when she slept. Yes, I watched her sleep. It was my duty, I told myself. But in the deepest hours of night, when the castle settled into silence and moonlight painted her face in silver, I knew it was something far more dangerous than duty that kept me transfixed by the rise and fall of her chest beneath silk nightgowns. I was falling in love with the queen I was sworn to protect, and I was certain it would destroy us both. The first assassination attempt came 2 weeks after my assignment began. I woke from light sleep to the whisper of steel against leather, the barely audible footstep on stone. 3 assassins had scaled the tower wall, thinking to find the queen defenseless in her bed. They found me instead, The fight was brief but vicious. I moved through shadows like death itself, my blade singing as it found flesh and bone. The first man fell with my dagger between his ribs before he could draw breath to scream. The second managed to clash swords with me twice before I opened his throat. The third, realizing his companions were dead, tried to flee. I caught him at the window and drove my sword through his back, watching his body tumble into the courtyard far below. Through it all, Queen Monique never woke. I cleaned my blade and removed the bodies, then knelt beside her bed to watch her peaceful slumber. In sleep she looked younger, more vulnerable. The weight of the crown didn't press upon her features. I reached out, almost touching her cheek, then pulled my hand back. Even in her sleep, she was untouchable. The next morning brought panic when the bodies were discovered. The Queen's advisors swarmed around her like angry wasps, demanding increased security, questioning my competence. Through it all, she remained calm, her eyes finding mine across the crowded chamber. In that look, I read gratitude and something else, something that made my pulse quicken. Later, when the advisors had dispersed and we were alone in her study, she finally spoke to me about the attack. Her voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands as she poured wine into 2 goblets. She offered one to me, a breach of protocol that neither of us acknowledged. We drank in silence, the weight of what had happened settling between us like a living thing. From that night forward something changed. The careful distance between Queen and guard began to erode. She would catch my eye during council meetings and I would see humor there, as if we shared some private joke about the pompous lords vying for her attention. When she walked in her gardens, she began to slow her pace, allowing me to walk closer beside her rather than the prescribed 3 steps behind. These small intimacies felt monumental. Each shared glance, each moment when her fingers accidentally brushed mine as she handed me a document, each time she said my name with that particular softness, they all carved deeper channels in my heart for dangerous feelings to flow through. But the enemies circling her throne were far from finished with their schemes. Lord Polly was the first to show his true colors. I had never trusted the Queen's elderly treasurer, with his calculating eyes and obsequious manner. My instincts proved correct when I discovered him meeting in secret with merchants from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Hidden in the shadows of a stable, I listened as he discussed weakening trade agreements and strategic military positions. He was selling information about Queen Monique's defenses. The revelation struck me like ice water. How many others in the court were playing similar games? How deep did this conspiracy run? I thought of all the people with access to the Queen, all the servants and advisors and nobles who moved freely through the castle. Any one of them could be planning her death. That night, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. Instead of reporting Polly's treachery immediately, I chose to watch and wait, to gather more information about the full scope of the plot against my Queen. It was a tactical decision, the kind of patient intelligence gathering that had served me well in previous assignments. But it nearly cost Monique her life. The second assassination attempt came during the Harvest Festival, when the castle was full of visitors and celebration. A serving girl, no more than 16, approached the Queen's table with a goblet of wine. Something in her nervous manner caught my attention. The way her hands shook, the sheen of sweat on her pale forehead despite the cool evening air. I moved without thinking, striking the goblet from the girl's hands just as Monique raised it to her lips. The wine spilled across the white tablecloth like blood, and in the sudden silence that followed, the girl's face crumpled with terror and shame. Later, under interrogation, she revealed everything. Polly had threatened her younger brother's life, forcing her to poison the Queen's wine. The poison was a slow-acting toxin that would have appeared to be natural illness, taking days to kill while causing excruciating pain. I wanted to kill Polly with my bare hands. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not the cold fury of battle, but something hot and protective and utterly consuming. No one would hurt her. No one would take her from me. The intensity of these feelings should have warned me how far I had already fallen. That night, after Polly had been arrested and the serving girl pardoned, Queen Monique summoned me to her private chambers. She was standing by the window when I entered, still wearing her formal gown from the festival but with her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her like that, royal yet relaxed, beautiful yet real, made something flutter in my stomach like trapped birds. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and in the candlelight, I could see she had been crying. Not the dramatic tears of a pampered noble, but quiet tracts of moisture that spoke of genuine fear and gratitude. For the first time since becoming her guard, she dismissed protocol entirely. She crossed the room to where I stood at attention and reached up to cup my face in her hands. Her touch was electric, sending shockwaves through my entire body. I should have stepped back, should have maintained proper distance, but I was lost the moment her skin touched mine. Her thumbs traced the line of my cheekbones as she studied my face with an intensity that made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for me in the intimate space we had created between us. She thanked me, not as a queen thanking a guard, but as a woman grateful to someone who had saved her life. Her words washed over me like warm honey, and I found myself leaning into her touch despite every instinct screaming that this was forbidden. Then she did something that changed everything between us. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to my forehead just above my brow. It was meant to be a chaste kiss of gratitude, I think, but when she pulled back, our faces were still close enough that I could feel her breath against my skin. The air between us crackled with tension and possibility. I don't know which of us moved first. Perhaps we both did, drawn together by forces stronger than duty or protocol or common sense. Our lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of what we were unleashing. But when she sighed against my mouth and her fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, the kiss deepened into something that burned away every rational thought in my head. She tasted like wine and strawberries and something uniquely her that I knew I would crave for the rest of my life. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the magnitude of what we had done crashed over us like a cold wave. I was a commoner, a soldier, a woman whose hands were stained with blood. She was a queen, divine by birth, promised to marry for political alliance rather than love. We stared at each other in the flickering candlelight, both of us knowing that everything had changed and nothing could ever be the same. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of stolen moments and careful discretion. In public, we maintained the proper relationship between queen and guard. But in private, when the doors were closed and the servants dismissed, we allowed ourselves to exist in a bubble of impossible love. She would find excuses to touch me, adjusting the clasp of my cloak, brushing dust from my shoulder, letting her fingers linger when she handed me documents. I lived for these moments, storing up each touch like a miser hoarding gold. Our conversations became deeper, more intimate. She told me about her childhood, about the weight of expectations that had rested on her shoulders since birth. She spoke of loneliness, of being surrounded by people who wanted something from her but never truly saw her as a person rather than a symbol. I shared stories of my own past, the poverty that had driven me to become a soldier, the battles that had hardened me, the code of honor that guided my actions. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she truly cared about understanding who I was beneath the armor. The physical attraction between us was undeniable, but it was these quiet conversations that truly bound us together. She was brilliant and funny and kind, with a sharp wit that could make me laugh even in the darkest moments. Being with her felt like coming home to a place I had never known I was looking for. But our secret was dangerous beyond measure. Lady Helen, the Queen's chief lady-in-waiting, began to watch us with suspicious eyes. She was an intelligent woman, politically astute, and I could see her cataloging every glance that lingered too long, every smile that seemed too warm for mere professional courtesy. The pressure of maintaining our facade was exhausting. In council meetings, I would stand at attention behind the Queen's chair, fighting the urge to touch her shoulder or lean down to whisper in her ear. During formal dinners, I watched from my post by the wall as various lords and ambassadors paid court to her, knowing that some of them were evaluating her as a potential bride for their sons or allies. The thought of her marrying someone else, of being touched by hands other than mine, of sharing her bed with a man who would never appreciate the brilliant, complex woman she was, it ate at me like acid. But worse than jealousy was fear. Fear that our secret would be discovered, that she would be forced to choose between love and crown, that I would be executed as a traitor for daring to touch someone so far above my station. Love, I was learning, was not just joy and passion. It was terror and desperation and the constant ache of wanting something you could never truly have. The winter solstice ball was the social event of the season, bringing together nobility from across the continent. The great ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and silk gowns, alive with music and laughter and the subtle wheeling and dealing of politics disguised as entertainment. Queen Monique was magnificent that night. Her gown was deep emerald silk that brought out the color of her eyes, cut in lines that emphasized her grace and elegance. Diamonds glittered at her throat and in her hair, catching the light as she moved through the crowd like a living jewel. I stood in my designated position along the wall, dressed in my formal guard uniform, watching as dance partner after dance partner claimed her attention. Each time she placed her hand in someone else's, each time she allowed them to lead her around the floor, I felt something twist painfully in my chest. But even across the crowded ballroom she found ways to communicate with me. A glance over her partner's shoulder that lingered just a moment too long. A smile that seemed meant only for me despite being surrounded by admirers. The subtle way she positioned herself during conversations so that she could keep me in her line of sight. The evening's most dangerous moment came when Prince Erwin of Northmark, a potential suitor being pushed by the Queen's advisors, claimed her for what should have been the final dance of the evening. He was handsome enough, with golden hair and blue eyes, wealthy and powerful and everything a queen should want in a husband. I watched them dance and felt something dark and possessive rise up in me. The way he held her too close, the proprietary manner in which his hands rested on her body, the practiced charm with which he whispered in her ear, it all made me want to draw my sword and challenge him to combat for the right to touch her. Then, in a moment of perfect choreography that could have been planned, the music swelled and she turned in his arms in such a way that she was facing directly toward me. Our eyes met across the crowded dance floor, and in that gaze, I saw everything she couldn't say aloud. She was mine and I was hers, regardless of crowns or titles or the expectations of others. When the dance ended, Prince Erwin bent to kiss her hand, lingering over the gesture in a way that made clear his intentions. But even as she smiled graciously at him, her eyes found mine again, and I saw the silent message there. None of them matter. Only you. Later, after the last guest had departed and the ballroom stood empty except for servants clearing away the remnants of celebration, she summoned me to her chambers with the excuse of discussing security concerns. The moment the door closed behind us, she was in my arms, kissing me with desperate hunger, as if she had been starving for my touch all evening. That night we crossed a line from which there could be no return. I had intended to maintain some boundaries even in our private moments. Physical affection, yes, but nothing that would completely compromise her honor or my duty. But resistance crumbled the moment she began unlacing her gown, her eyes never leaving mine as silken diamonds fell away to reveal the woman beneath the crown. She was perfect, not in the way of statues or paintings, but in the way of living, breathing beauty that comes from being truly seen and desired. Every curve and line of her seemed designed to fit against me, and when she pulled me down onto her bed, all thoughts of propriety and consequence fled my mind. I worshipped her with my hands and mouth, learning every place that made her gasp and arch beneath me. She was responsive and eager, matching my passion with her own, giving herself to me completely without reservation or shame. When she cried out my name in the darkness, her voice breaking with pleasure, I knew that I would never be the same. This woman, this queen, had claimed me more thoroughly than any oath of fealty ever could. Afterward, we lay entwined in her silk sheets, her head pillowed on my shoulder, my fingers combing through her hair. The candles had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and in that intimate golden light, she looked like something from a dream. She traced patterns on my chest with her fingertip, and I could feel her thinking, feel the weight of what we had done settling between us. We both knew this changed everything. We both knew it was dangerous beyond measure. But when she lifted her head to look at me, when she smiled with such pure joy that it took my breath away, I knew that no matter what consequences awaited us, this moment was worth any price. I would have bled for her before that night. Now I knew I would gladly die for her, not just as my queen, but as the woman who had claimed my heart so completely that I no longer remembered who I had been without her. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of my life, despite the constant undercurrent of danger that accompanied our secret. We became masters of stolen moments, a touch that lingered when she handed me papers, conversations that carried double meanings for my ears alone, glances across crowded rooms that spoke volumes. My quarters adjoined hers through a hidden passage built into the castle walls, originally designed for the monarch's escape in times of siege. Instead, it became our pathway to each other, allowing me to slip into her chambers after the castle slept without being observed by curious servants or suspicious courtiers. Those midnight hours became sacred to us. Sometimes we made love with desperate passion, clinging to each other as if we could somehow merge into one being that could never be separated. Other times we simply talked, sharing dreams and fears and thoughts we could never voice in daylight. She told me about her vision for the kingdom, plans for schools and hospitals, trade agreements that would bring prosperity to the common people, reforms that would limit the power of corrupt nobles. Her intelligence and compassion amazed me daily. She was not just beautiful but brilliant, not just royal but revolutionary in her quiet way. I shared my own dreams, things I had never spoken aloud to anyone. The small house I had always imagined owning, with a garden where I could grow herbs and vegetables. The desire to travel beyond the borders of our kingdom, to see the ocean and foreign cities. The family I had never thought I could have, given my profession and station. In the darkness of her chambers, with her warm body pressed against mine, these dreams seemed almost possible. We would speak in whispers of a different life, one where titles and duties didn't dictate who we could love, where we could wake up together every morning without fear of discovery, where she could simply be Monique and I could be Jules, two women in love without the weight of a kingdom pressing down on us. But dawn always came, bringing with it the return to roles and responsibilities that kept us apart. The strain of maintaining our secret began to show in small ways. She grew pale from lost sleep and I became hypervigilant, seeing potential threats in every shadow. Lady Helen's suspicious glances grew more frequent, and I caught her several times lingering outside the Queen's chambers at odd hours. The pressure was building towards something that would either free us or destroy us completely. The kingdom's political situation grew more precarious as winter deepened into spring. Reports came from the northern borders of increased military activity in Astoria. Trade negotiations with the eastern kingdoms had stalled over disputes about tariff rates. Several minor lords had been discovered in treasonous correspondence, suggesting a broader conspiracy against the crown. Queen Monique worked tirelessly to address these challenges, spending long hours in council meetings and private consultations with her advisors. I watched her grow thinner, more fragile as the weight of leadership pressed down on her. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her smile became forced during public appearances. The worst part was that I could offer her comfort only in stolen moments. During the day when she faced skeptical advisors and demanding petitioners, I had to stand silently at my post, watching her struggle alone. The distance protocol demanded between us felt like physical pain. Lord Joseph began pushing more aggressively for her to consider marriage alliances as a solution to the kingdom's diplomatic problems. Prince Erwin of Northmark had formally requested her hand, offering military support against Astoria in exchange for a wedding by midsummer. The Eastern Kingdoms had also sent envoys with similar proposals, each presenting marriage as the key to stability and prosperity. I stood behind her chair during these discussions, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to defend her right to choose her own fate. She handled the pressure with grace, deflecting proposals with diplomatic language while avoiding outright refusals that might cause offense. But I could see the toll it was taking. After particularly difficult council sessions, she would dismiss everyone except me, then lean back in her chair with her eyes closed, looking utterly exhausted. One evening, after a particularly heated debate about the Northmark proposal, she finally spoke her fears aloud. We were alone in her study, the door locked against interruption, and she sat curled in the chair by the fireplace while I stood at my usual post. But the formal distance felt unbearable that night, and when she gestured for me to come sit beside her, I abandoned protocol entirely. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and spoke of the impossible choice she faced. Marry for political advantage and secure the kingdom's future, or follow her heart and risk everything she had been raised to protect. The anguish in her voice broke something inside me. Here was a woman who had never been allowed to make a single choice for herself. Not what to wear, not where to go, not whom to marry. Every aspect of her life had been decided by others for the good of the realm. I held her as she wept silently, her tears soaking through my shirt, and I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I would find a way to free us both no matter what it cost. The solution came to me in the dark hours before dawn, as I lay sleepless beside my sleeping queen. It was dangerous, perhaps impossible, but it was the only path I could see that led to any kind of future for us together. I would have to become indispensable to her in a different way. Not just as a guard, but as an advisor, a confidant, someone whose counsel she could not live without. If I could prove my worth to the kingdom beyond my sword arm, perhaps I could earn a position that would allow us to remain together even if she were forced to marry. It wasn't the life we dreamed of, but it would be something. I could protect her from within the court, help guide her decisions, and perhaps find moments of closeness even within the constraints of political necessity. The plan required me to step beyond my role as a simple guard. I began studying maps and trade agreements, learning about economics and diplomacy with the same intensity one had once devoted to swordplay. I cultivated relationships with merchants and minor nobles, gathering information about the kingdom's needs and opportunities. Queen Monique noticed the change in my behavior immediately. during our private moments, she questioned my late nights spent reading instead of sleeping, my distracted manner during conversations. I couldn't tell her the full truth, that I was trying to become someone worthy of staying by her side regardless of what political marriage she might be forced into. Instead, I told her I wanted to be more useful to her, to understand the challenges she faced beyond mere physical protection. She seemed pleased by my interest, sharing books from her private library and explaining the complexities of governing that were never visible to the common people. What I didn't anticipate was how this deeper involvement in court politics would expose us to new dangers. By positioning myself as more than just a guard, I attracted attention from people who saw influence over the Queen's trusted advisor as a valuable commodity. Bribes were offered, threats made, subtle pressures applied to try to sway my counsel toward various interests. More dangerously, my unusual access to the Queen began to raise questions among the more observant courtiers. Lady Helen started making pointed comments about the propriety of a common-born guard spending so much time in private consultation with the monarch. Other advisors questioned whether military personnel should be involved in matters of statecraft. The scrutiny was becoming unbearable, but I pressed forward with my plan because I could see no alternative. The marriage proposals were becoming more insistent, the political pressure more intense. Time was running out for us to find any solution that didn't end with complete separation. Then Margaret of Westhold arrived at court and everything changed. Lady Margaret was everything I was not. Noble-born, educated in the finest schools, beautiful in the conventional way that court ladies were expected to be. She arrived as part of a delegation from the Western Kingdoms, but it quickly became apparent that her true purpose was to assess Queen Monique as a potential wife for her brother, Duke William of Westhold. But Margaret had her own agenda. From the moment she was presented to the Queen at a formal court session, I could see the way she looked at Monique. It was not the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a political alliance, but something more personal, more intimate. She wanted the Queen for herself. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Here was someone who could openly court the woman I loved, someone whose affections would be welcomed rather than hidden, someone who could offer marriage and legitimacy instead of secrecy and shame. Margaret was charming, intelligent, and skilled in all the arts expected of a court lady. She could dance, sing, compose poetry, and conduct brilliant conversations about literature and philosophy. She had traveled extensively and could regale dinner parties with entertaining stories of foreign customs and exotic lands. Worse, Queen Monique seemed genuinely to enjoy her company. I watched from my position against the wall as Margaret made herself indispensable to the Queen's social life. She organized musical evenings and poetry readings, suggested improvements to the castle gardens, and gradually positioned herself as the Queen's closest female companion. The sight of them together was torture. Margaret could sit beside the Queen during meals, could offer her arm during walks in the garden, could touch her hand or shoulder in casual conversation without anyone questioning the propriety of such gestures. I began to see my own presence as increasingly superfluous. What did a rough soldier have to offer compared to this cultured lady who could match the Queen's wit and education? How could I compete with someone who could openly declare her affections and be welcomed rather than feared? The breaking point came during a poetry recital that Margaret had organized for the Queen's entertainment. I stood at my post, watching as Margaret read love sonnets with obvious personal meaning, her eyes never leaving the Queen's face as she spoke of devotion and desire. Queen Monique's response was gracious but reserved, yet I could see she was not unmoved by the attention. When Margaret finished her recitation and the small audience applauded, the Queen thanked her with genuine warmth. That night, when Monique summoned me to her chambers, I could barely bring myself to look at her. She knew immediately that something was wrong. I had never been able to hide my feelings from her, and the jealousy and despair I was experiencing must have been written clearly on my face. She dismissed her ladies earlier than usual and waited until we were completely alone before approaching me. I stood rigid at attention, trying to maintain professional distance, but she would have none of it. When she touched my face, I nearly broke down completely. Her hands were soft and warm, and I wanted nothing more than to lean into her touch and forget everything else in the world. But the image of Margaret reading love poetry to her was seared into my mind. She asked me what was troubling me, and for a long moment I couldn't speak. How could I voice the fears that were eating me alive? How could I admit that I was terrified of losing her to someone who could offer her everything I could not? Finally, the words spilled out of me in a rush of pain and desperation. I told her about watching Margaret court her, about seeing the way they looked together, about the growing certainty that I would soon be replaced by someone more suitable to be the companion of a queen. Her response surprised me. Instead of reassurance or denial, she pulled away from me, anger flashing in her green eyes. She was furious that I could think so little of her feelings, that I could believe she would discard what we had together for the sake of social convenience. Did I think her love was so shallow that it could be swayed by pretty poetry and courtly manners? Did I trust her so little that I assumed she would choose respectability over genuine affection? Her words cut deep because they forced me to confront the truth about my own insecurities. I didn't doubt her love, I doubted my own worth. I had spent so long believing that someone like me could never truly deserve someone like her that I had begun to expect loss as inevitable. But as we stood there facing each other across the growing space between us, I realized that my fears were becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. By pulling away, by assuming the worst, I was damaging the very relationship I was trying to protect. She was right to be angry. She deserved better than a lover who doubted her constancy at the first sign of external pressure. When I tried to apologize, to explain that my fears came from love rather than distrust, she stopped me with a gesture. The damage was done. I had shown her that I didn't truly believe in what we had together, and that revelation had created a rift between us that apologies alone could not bridge. That night, for the first time in months, I slept alone in my own quarters, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had just destroyed the most important thing in my life through my own weakness and insecurity. The days that followed were agony. We maintained the professional relationship required by our respective positions, but the warmth and intimacy that had developed between us was gone. She was polite but distant, and I was too ashamed of my behavior to try to bridge the gap I had created. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her subtle courtship, seemingly unaware of the drama playing out around her. She organized more entertainments, presented the Queen with thoughtful gifts, and generally made herself indispensable to court life. I watched it all from my position as guard, feeling increasingly isolated and unnecessary. The Queen no longer sought my counsel on political matters, no longer found excuses to speak with me privately. When our eyes met across crowded rooms, I saw polite acknowledgement where once there had been love and desire. The worst part was that I could see how much happier she seemed with Margaret's company. They laughed together, engaged in spirited debates about books and art, and generally appeared to genuinely enjoy each other's intellectual companionship. Perhaps I had been right all along. Perhaps Margaret could offer her something I never could. A relationship based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than just physical attraction and forbidden passion. The thought should have brought me peace, knowing that the woman I loved might find happiness even if it wasn't with me. Instead, it filled me with a hollow despair that made each day feel like an endurance trial. I began to seriously consider requesting a transfer to another position, perhaps guard duty at one of the kingdom's distant outposts. Staying to watch her fall in love with someone else felt like torture, but leaving would mean abandoning my sworn duty to protect her. The decision was made for me when reports arrived of increased military activity along the Asturian border. A reconnaissance mission was needed, dangerous work that would take me away from court for several weeks. I volunteered immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to escape the impossible situation I had created. The night before my departure, Queen Monique summoned me for what I assumed would be a formal briefing about the mission's objectives. Instead, she dismissed her other advisors and spoke to me alone for the first time since our confrontation. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of her responsibilities had increased in the weeks since we had last truly talked. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying emotion she was trying to suppress. She thanked me for my service, acknowledged the dangers of the mission I was undertaking, and expressed her confidence in my abilities. All formal, appropriate words that revealed nothing of her true feelings. But then, just as I was preparing to leave, she added something that stopped me in my tracks. She told me that she had never doubted my love for her, and that she hoped I would come to understand that her anger had come from hurt rather than rejection. She said that some bonds could not be broken by misunderstandings or external pressures, and that she would always treasure what we had shared together. It was as close to a declaration of forgiveness as protocol would allow, and it gave me hope that perhaps if I survived the mission ahead, we might find a way back to each other. I wanted to tell her that I loved her, that I was sorry for doubting us, that she was worth any sacrifice. But the words stuck in my throat, trapped by duty and propriety and the knowledge that we were likely being observed by guards posted outside the door. Instead, I knelt before her chair and kissed her hand in the formal gesture of a sworn knight taking leave of their sovereign. But when my lips pressed against her skin, I felt her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly around mine, and I knew she understood everything I couldn't say aloud. The next morning, I rode out of the castle gates with a small company of scouts, not knowing that I would never see her alive again. The reconnaissance mission took us deep into the disputed borderlands, where Asturian forces had been conducting mysterious maneuvers for weeks. What we discovered there chilled my blood and sent me racing back toward the capital with news that could not wait for normal diplomatic channels. Astoria was planning a full-scale invasion, timed to coincide with the Queen's upcoming birthday celebration when the castle would be full of guests and the guards' attention divided. They had been building supply depots and moving troops under cover of supposed trade caravans, positioning themselves for a coordinated strike that would capture or kill Queen Monique and install a puppet ruler favorable to Asturian interests. I pushed my horse to its limits, changing mounts at every way station, desperate to reach the capital in time to warn of the approaching danger. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between successful preparation and catastrophic surprise. But I was already too late. When I crested the hill overlooking the castle, I saw smoke rising from several buildings within the walls. The main gate hung open, its iron portcullis twisted and broken. Bodies littered the courtyard, and I could hear the distant sounds of fighting still echoing from within. The invasion had begun early. I abandoned my exhausted horse and scaled the outer wall using the same route the first assassins had taken months before. The castle was in chaos. Asturian soldiers moving through corridors I knew better than my own name, servants fleeing in terror, the clash of steel against steel echoing from multiple directions. My only thought was reaching Queen Monique, protecting her from whatever forces had breached her defenses. I moved through the familiar passages like a ghost, avoiding enemy patrols, taking down isolated soldiers with swift, silent efficiency. The bodies I found told the story of fierce resistance. The castle guard had fought bravely, but they had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and the element of surprise. I recognized faces among the fallen, good soldiers who had served loyally and died defending their queen. When I finally reached the royal quarters, I found the corridors slick with blood and the air thick with smoke from burning tapestries. The sounds of battle were closer here, more intense, suggesting that the final defense was still ongoing. I pressed myself against the wall outside the queen's chambers and listened carefully. Voices inside, some familiar, some foreign. The ring of steel on steel. A woman's voice raised in defiance, and my heart nearly stopped at the sound. Monique was still alive, still fighting. I entered the chamber like a force of nature, my sword singing as it cleared its scabbard. The scene that greeted me was one that would be burned into my memory forever. Queen Monique stood with her back to the great window, a bloodied sword in her hands, her silk gown torn and stained with battle. Around her lay the bodies of her personal guards, brave men and women who had died trying to protect her. Facing her were 3 Asturian soldiers, advancing slowly with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. But what stopped my heart was the sight of Lady Helen lying motionless near the overturned furniture, a spreading pool of blood beneath her still form. Margaret knelt beside her, pressing a cloth to a wound in her side, her face streaked with tears and gore. The enemy soldiers turned as I burst through the door, but they were too slow. My blade took the first one through the neck before he could fully face me. The second managed to raise his sword but couldn't match the fury that drove my attack. I opened his chest from shoulder to hip in a single devastating stroke. The third soldier, seeing his companions fall, tried to use Queen Monique as a human shield, grabbing her around the throat and pressing his dagger to her neck. He shouted demands in Asturian, safe passage in exchange for the queen's life. I could see the calculation in Monique's eyes, the way she was measuring distances and angles even with steel at her throat. She was planning something desperate, and I knew I had to act before she could sacrifice herself in some heroic gesture. The throw was perfect. My dagger flew across the room in a silver arc and took the soldier in the eye, punching through bone and brain to emerge from the back of his skull. He dropped like a stone, his own blade clattering harmlessly to the floor. For a moment, blessed silence filled the chamber. Then Monique was running toward me, and I caught her in my arms, holding her against my chest as if I could somehow merge our bodies into one being that could never be separated again. She was alive. Wounded, exhausted, but alive. I could feel her heart beating against mine, could smell the familiar scent of her hair beneath the smoke and blood. Nothing else mattered in that moment. Not duty, not protocol, not the political implications of our embrace. But our reunion was brief. The sounds of battle were growing closer, and I could hear boots in the corridor outside. More enemies were coming, drawn by the noise of our fight. Margaret looked up from where she knelt beside Helen's still form, her face streaked with tears. She spoke in a voice raw with grief and fear, telling us that Helen was dead, killed trying to defend the queen when the attack began. The older woman had fought like a lioness, Margaret said, taking down 2 soldiers before falling to a third's blade. I felt a stab of unexpected sorrow at the news. Helen had been suspicious of my relationship with the queen, yes, but she had also been fiercely loyal and protective. She had died as she lived, in service to her sovereign. But there was no time for proper mourning. The enemy was regrouping and our position was untenable. The castle had fallen and staying would mean certain death or capture. I made the hardest decision of my life. I told Queen Monique that we had to run, had to abandon the castle and find safety elsewhere. The kingdom might be lost, but she could still live to fight another day, to rally loyal forces and eventually reclaim what was hers. She refused. Standing there in her blood-stained gown, surrounded by the bodies of those who had died protecting her, she spoke with quiet dignity about duty and responsibility. She would not abandon her people to live under foreign rule. She would not flee like a coward while her subjects suffered under occupation. If she was to die, she would die as a queen defending her throne to the last breath. I understood her position, admired it even, but I couldn't accept it. The woman I loved was choosing death over life, honor over survival, and there was nothing I could do to change her mind. Margaret, meanwhile, had risen from Helen's side and was moving toward the secret passage I had used so many times to visit the Queen in private. She knew about it. Of course she did. As the Queen's companion, she would have been told of all escape routes in case of emergency. She begged Monique to reconsider, to think of what the kingdom would lose if she died here. A dead queen could inspire martyrdom, yes, but a living queen could lead actual resistance. The people needed hope, not just another tragic story of noble sacrifice. But Monique was resolute. She had made her choice, and nothing we said would sway her from it. That was when I realized what I had to do. I moved behind her as she stood facing the door, prepared to meet her death with dignity. My arms came around her from behind, one hand covering her mouth to muffle her protests, the other applying pressure to a specific point on her neck that would render her unconscious without permanent harm. It was a technique I had learned in my soldier training, meant for capturing enemy officers alive. I had never imagined using it on the woman I loved, but I couldn't stand by and watch her throw her life away on a gesture, however noble. She struggled briefly, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal above my restraining hand. Then her body went limp in my arms and I caught her weight against my chest. Margaret stared at me in horror, and I saw my own actions reflected in her expression. The violation of consent, the betrayal of trust, the presumption of making such a choice for someone else. But I would rather have Monique hate me and live than love me and die. I lifted the Queen's unconscious form and carried her toward the hidden passage, gesturing for Margaret to follow. Behind us, the sounds of approaching soldiers grew louder. We escaped through the secret ways just as enemy forces broke down the chamber door. The hidden passages led to a series of caves beneath the castle, part of an ancient network that had been carved out centuries ago as siege defenses. I had studied these tunnels during my first weeks as the Queen's Guard, memorizing every twist and branch in case emergency evacuation became necessary. Now, carrying Monique's limp form through the narrow, twisting darkness, I was grateful for that foresight. Margaret followed close behind, her court dress torn and impractical for cave navigation, but her determination unwavering. She had grabbed a bag of supplies before we fled, food, water, and some of the Queen's personal effects that might be useful for proving her identity to potential allies. When Queen Monique regained consciousness, we were already several miles from the castle, hidden in a natural chamber deep beneath the earth. She woke slowly, confusion giving way to memory and then to fury when she realized what I had done. She raged at me in whispers that echoed off the stone walls, calling me traitor and kidnapper and worse. I accepted every accusation because they were all true. I had betrayed her trust, violated her autonomy, and stolen her right to choose her own fate. But she was alive, and that was worth any condemnation she might heap upon me. Margaret tried to mediate between us, pointing out that recriminations could wait until we reached safety. The immediate priority was getting far enough from the castle to avoid capture, finding loyal forces who might help us plan a counterattack. But I could see in Monique's eyes that something fundamental had changed between us. The trust that had been damaged by my jealousy was now completely shattered by my presumption. I had made her survival my choice rather than hers, and she would never forgive me for it. We traveled for 3 days through the underground network, emerging only at night to get fresh air and check our direction. The Queen spoke to me only when absolutely necessary, directing her conversation primarily toward Margaret, who had somehow become her preferred companion in this desperate flight. When we finally reached the exit point, a concealed cave mouth in the hills 20 miles from the capital, we found a changed world waiting for us. Smoke rose from multiple points on the horizon, suggesting that the invasion had spread beyond the castle to the surrounding towns. Refugee camps dotted the landscape, filled with people who had fled the Astery in advance. The kingdom we had known was gone, replaced by military occupation and civilian suffering. Among the refugees we found scattered groups of surviving soldiers, nobles who had escaped the initial assault, and common folk who had chosen exile over submission. They were ready to fight, hungry for leadership, desperate for hope. When Queen Monique revealed herself to these people, their response was immediate and overwhelming. Here was their rightful ruler, alive and free, ready to lead them in resistance against the invaders. The despair that had marked their faces transformed into something fierce and determined. But organizing an effective rebellion would take time, resources, and careful planning. We needed secure bases, reliable supply lines, and intelligence about enemy positions and movements. Most importantly, we needed the Queen to stay alive long enough to see the kingdom restored. The resistance movement that grew around Queen Monique was unlike anything I had experienced in my years of military service. These were not professional soldiers following orders, but ordinary people transformed by desperation and loyalty into something approaching an army. We established our primary base in the ruins of an ancient monastery, hidden deep in the forest where Asterian patrols rarely ventured. From there we coordinated raids on enemy supply lines, rescued prisoners from occupying forces, and gradually built a network of safe houses and communication routes. Margaret proved unexpectedly valuable in this new role. Her noble education had included languages and mathematics, skills that were essential for coded communications and resource management. She could speak fluent Asterian, allowing her to gather intelligence from captured prisoners and intercepted documents. More than that, she had a gift for organization and logistics that kept our ragtag rebellion functioning despite limited resources and constant danger. She coordinated food distribution, managed our meager treasury, and maintained detailed records of personnel and equipment. I focused on what I did best: training recruits in combat techniques, planning and executing military operations, and serving as the Queen's personal bodyguard in increasingly dangerous circumstances. But the dynamic between the three of us had shifted permanently. Queen Monique relied on Margaret's counsel and companionship in ways that highlighted my own limitations. Where I could offer protection and tactical expertise, Margaret provided intellectual stimulation and emotional support. I watched them grow closer with a mixture of resignation and bitter acceptance. They would sit together late into the night, planning operations and discussing strategy, their heads bent close over maps and reports. They shared private jokes and meaningful glances that excluded me as thoroughly as any locked door. The Queen's anger toward me had cooled into something worse: indifference. She was polite but distant, professional but never personal. The intimacy we had once shared seemed like something from another lifetime, a beautiful dream that had ended in betrayal and loss. Yet I continued to serve, continued to protect her, continued to love her with a devotion that was no longer wanted or welcomed. Because whatever had changed between us personally, my oath to defend her remained unbroken. The rebellion grew stronger over the months that followed. We liberated towns, disrupted enemy operations, and gradually pushed back against the Asterian occupation. Queen Monique proved herself to be a natural leader, inspiring loyalty and courage in everyone who served under her banner. But victory came at a terrible cost. The casualties mounted with each successful operation. Brave men and women who had joined our cause fell in battle, died in raids, or disappeared into enemy prisons never to be seen again. Each loss wore at the Queen's spirit, adding lines to her face and shadows to her eyes. She blamed herself for every death, carried the weight of each sacrifice as if it were a personal failure. I watched her grow thinner, more fragile, despite Margaret's efforts to care for her physical and emotional needs. The worst loss came during a rescue operation that went catastrophically wrong. We had received intelligence about a group of captured nobles being held in an Asturian fortress, including several members of the Queen's former council. The rescue was meant to be quick and surgical. Get in, free the prisoners, get out before enemy reinforcements could respond. But the intelligence was false, planted by Asturian agents who had infiltrated our network. Instead of rescuing allies, we walked into a carefully prepared trap. The ambush was devastating. Half our strike force was killed in the initial assault, and the survivors found themselves pinned down by superior numbers and firepower. I fought like a demon, trying to create an escape route for the Queen and her remaining guards, but the situation was hopeless. That was when Margaret made her choice. She had insisted on accompanying the mission despite both the Queen's protests and my own objections. Her language skills, she argued, might be crucial for communicating with prisoners or interrogating captured enemies. Now, with Asturian soldiers closing in from all sides, she saw an opportunity to buy time for the others to escape. She broke from cover and ran toward the enemy positions, shouting demands in fluent Asturian for them to cease fire and accept her surrender. Her noble bearing and obvious importance made the soldiers hesitate just long enough for her ploy to work. In that moment of confusion, I grabbed Queen Monique and dragged her toward the prepared escape route. She fought me, trying to go back for Margaret, but I was stronger and more desperate. I would not lose her no matter what it cost. The last thing I saw before we disappeared into the forest was Margaret standing proud and defiant as enemy soldiers surrounded her, her chin raised in aristocratic contempt even as they bound her hands behind her back. We never saw her again. The loss of Margaret broke something inside Queen Monique that I had never seen damaged before. She had lost advisors and guards and subjects throughout the rebellion, but this was different. This was personal. Margaret had been her friend, her companion, possibly her love, and she had sacrificed herself to save a queen who might not have made the same choice in return. For weeks after the failed rescue, Monique barely spoke. She went through the motions of leadership, attending meetings and making necessary decisions, but the spark that had made her such an inspiring figure seemed extinguished. I tried to offer comfort, but she rejected every attempt at consolation. The woman who had once sought my touch now flinched away when I came too close, as if my presence reminded her of all the ways she had been failed by those who claimed to love her. The irony was not lost on me. I had betrayed her trust to save her life, and Margaret had given her life to save the Queen's freedom. Between us, we had taken away every choice that mattered to her, and she would never forgive either of us for it. Yet the rebellion continued, driven now by a queen whose grief had transformed into something harder and more ruthless than her previous compassionate leadership. She approved increasingly dangerous operations, took greater personal risks, and pushed toward a final confrontation with the Asturian forces despite the potential cost in lives. I began to understand that she was seeking death, not avoiding it. Margaret's sacrifice had convinced her that she was not worth the lives being lost in her name, and she was determined to end the war through her own destruction if necessary. This realization filled me with a cold terror that had nothing to do with physical danger. I had saved her from one suicide only to watch her plan another, and this time I might not be able to stop her. The final battle was approaching. A massive assault on the capital city that would either restore the kingdom or destroy the resistance entirely. Queen Monique had already announced her intention to lead the charge personally, to be first through the breach when we stormed the castle walls. She framed it as inspirational leadership, but I knew better. She was planning to die gloriously in battle, to join Margaret in whatever afterlife awaited noble souls, and leave the burden of survival to others. I could not allow that to happen. The night before the final assault, I made one last attempt to reach the woman I had loved, to find some remnant of what we had once shared beneath the layers of grief and guilt that now defined her. I found her alone in the monastery's bell tower, looking out over the valley where our forces were gathered in preparation for the morning's battle. She looked ethereal in the moonlight, like a spirit already halfway departed from the world of the living. When I approached, she didn't turn or acknowledge my presence, but she didn't order me away either. We stood in silence for long minutes, both lost in our own thoughts about what the dawn would bring. Finally, I spoke the words I had been carrying inside me for months, the apology and explanation I had never been allowed to give. I told her that I was sorry for taking her choice away, for valuing her life above her honor, for loving her in ways that had ultimately caused more pain than joy. I acknowledged that my actions had been selfish, driven by my inability to imagine a world without her in it. But I also told her that I would make the same choice again every time, because her life mattered more than any principle or protocol or personal preference. She was worth saving, worth protecting, worth any sacrifice required to keep her breathing. She listened without comment, her profile carved in marble against the starlit sky. When I finished speaking, she finally turned to look at me, and I saw tears tracking down her cheeks like silver streams. Her response was whispered, meant only for my ears in that sacred space between earth and heaven. She told me that she had never stopped loving me, even when she hated what I had done. She said that the distance between us had been necessary protection, not punishment. Protection for both of us from the pain of wanting something that could never be. Margaret's death had shown her the true cost of love in wartime, the way caring for someone could become a weapon used against you. She couldn't afford such vulnerability, not when so many lives depended on her decisions. But tomorrow, when the battle began, all such concerns would become irrelevant. Tomorrow she would either reclaim her throne or die in the attempt, and either outcome would free us both from the impossible situation we had created. I understood then that she wasn't just planning to die, she was planning to die for me, to release me from the burden of loving someone I could never truly have. The thought filled me with rage and desperation and a love so fierce it felt like drowning. I couldn't let her sacrifice herself for my sake any more than I had been able to let her die for honor's sake. She was determined to end our story with her death, but I had other plans. The assault on the capital began at dawn, with our forces advancing across the valley under cover of early morning mist. Queen Monique rode at the front of the main column, her banner streaming behind her, looking every inch the warrior queen she had become. I stayed close to her side, my horse matching hers stride for stride, ready to intercept any threat that might emerge from the chaos of battle. Around us, the sound of marching feet and jangling equipment created a steady rhythm that spoke of determination and desperate hope. The Asturian defenders had prepared well for our assault. The walls bristled with archers and artillery, and the gates had been reinforced with additional barriers and defensive positions. Taking the city would require crossing open ground under heavy fire, then scaling walls or breaking through fortified entrances. It was a battle plan that virtually guaranteed massive casualties, but it was also our only realistic option. We lacked the resources for a prolonged siege, and winter was approaching rapidly. This assault would succeed or the rebellion would die. The first phase went better than expected. Our initial charge broke through the outer defensive lines, and we managed to establish positions close to the main walls without suffering catastrophic losses. But the real test came when we began the assault on the walls themselves. Queen Monique was magnificent in battle, her sword flashing like liquid lightning as she carved through enemy defenders. She fought with the desperate courage of someone who had nothing left to lose, inspiring our forces to feats of heroism that turned the tide of individual engagements. But I could see the calculation in her movements, the way she took unnecessary risks and placed herself in positions of maximum danger. She was seeking the glorious death she had promised herself, and no amount of tactical skill on my part could protect her from her own determination. The breakthrough came when we managed to ram through one of the secondary gates, creating a gap in the defenses that allowed our forces to pour into the city streets. From there, it became a running battle through familiar corridors and courtyards as we fought our way toward the castle proper. I stayed with the queen throughout the urban combat, watching her back as she led charge after charge against enemy positions. The sight of their rightful ruler fighting alongside them drove our soldiers to incredible efforts, and slowly, block by block, we pushed the Astorians back toward the castle walls. But when we finally stood before the gates of her former home, when victory was within reach, Queen Monique made her final play for martyrdom. The castle gates stood open, abandoned by defenders who had retreated to inner positions. Beyond them lay the courtyard where I had first seen Queen Monique months ago, where this entire story had begun. But the apparent abandonment was deceptive. I could see archers positioned in the windows above, artillery pieces aimed at the gateway, defensive positions prepared to turn the courtyard into a killing field. It was an obvious trap, designed to lure our forces into a confined space where they could be decimated by concentrated fire. Any competent military leader would recognize the danger and find an alternative approach. Instead, Queen Monique raised her sword and prepared to lead a direct charge through the gates. I grabbed her reins, forcing her horse to halt, and tried to convince her to reconsider. There had to be another way, side entrances, underground passages, some path that didn't require walking into certain death. But she looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only a strange peace that chilled me more than any battlefield terror ever had. She had found her moment, the perfect ending to a story that had been shaped by duty and love and impossible choices. She would die reclaiming her throne, and her death would inspire the final push that liberated the kingdom. Her sacrifice would give meaning to all the other sacrifices that had brought us to this point. She thanked me for everything I had done, everything I had been to her, and told me that she hoped I would find peace when the war was over. Then she spurred her horse forward, breaking my grip on the reins, and charged toward the gates with a cry that rang off the stone walls like a war horn. I followed, of course. I had no choice. Whatever she chose to do, wherever she chose to go, I would be beside her. If she was determined to die, then I would die with her. But as we galloped across the courtyard, as arrows began to fall around us like deadly rain, I made one last desperate decision. I drove my horse into hers, knocking her from the saddle just as the hidden artillery pieces fired. The blast that would have killed her instead caught me full in the chest, lifting me from my mount and hurling me across the stones. I felt my ribs crack, felt blood filling my lungs, felt the warmth spreading across my torso as life poured out through wounds no surgeon could heal. But I also felt satisfaction because she was alive, rolling behind the cover of an overturned cart, protected from the continuing barrage. As darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, I saw her face above me, saw her hands pressing against the wounds in my chest in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. She was crying, speaking words I couldn't quite hear over the ringing in my ears. But I could read her lips, could see the shape of my name as she repeated it like a prayer or a curse. I tried to smile, tried to tell her that it was worth it, that I would make the same choice 1,000 times over if it meant she would live. But the words wouldn't come, lost in the blood that was filling my throat. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was her face, beautiful and terrible in grief, the face of the woman I had loved more than life itself. I died there in the courtyard of the castle where I had first sworn to protect Queen Monique. The battle continued around my body, our forces eventually breaking through the remaining defenses and reclaiming the kingdom that was rightfully hers. But I like to think that my death served a purpose beyond just saving her life in that moment. Because she lived, she was able to rebuild what had been destroyed, to heal what had been wounded, to create something better from the ashes of war. She ruled for 43 more years, becoming known as Monique the Great, the queen who had fought alongside her people and never forgot the cost of freedom. She established schools and hospitals, reformed the laws that had oppressed the common folk, and built alliances that brought lasting peace to the region. She never married, despite pressure from advisors and foreign dignitaries. When asked about her decision, she would say that her heart belonged to the kingdom and could not be divided by personal attachments. But those closest to her knew better. They knew that she visited a certain grave in the royal cemetery every year on the anniversary of the liberation, that she kept a worn leather journal in her private chambers filled with poems about a love that transcended death, that she sometimes woke from dreams speaking a name that belonged to a long-dead guard. She commissioned no statues of me, established no monuments to my memory. But in the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, she would touch the place over her heart where my blood had stained her armor, and I knew that I lived on in the part of her that had died with me in that courtyard. Love, I learned in those final moments, is not about possession or permanence. It is about the willingness to sacrifice everything for the happiness of another, even when that sacrifice will never be recognized or rewarded. I had bled for the queen as I had always known I would. But more than that, I had loved her completely, without reservation, without condition, without hope of return. And in the end, that love had been enough to change the world.